Hi there, welcome to this surprise bonus lesson. As you might know, CSS Grid has arrived in Bricks with version 1.6.1. As a stopgap, I'm recording this quick video just to show you the basics so you can get started quickly. As I mentioned earlier in this module, CSS Grid is a layout module that's part of CSS, and as the name suggests, it is particularly suited to creating column grids. Both very straightforward ones like we've already made in this module so far, and very complicated ones like this, where you can put content in any cell, move any cell wherever you like, make them automatically flow at different breakpoints. But let's not worry about complex layouts with CSS Grid at this stage. The kind of basic layouts that you'll need 99% of the time are really easy to make. Does this mean that Flexbox is no longer useful? Absolutely not. In fact, you can still happily create column layouts with Flex as we've done in this module, no problem at all. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Flex is particularly well suited to aligning elements inside columns. Remember, for example, the site header we created a couple of lessons ago purely with Flex. No columns or grids required. But I will suggest that you start to get familiar with CSS Grid and consider using it to create column grid layouts because it does have some particular advantages for this over Flex. Here are the basics to get you started anyway, and I'll drop links to some other CSS Grid resources below. I've upgraded my site here to Bricks 1.6.1. It'll be available as an update for you in WordPress. As a demo, I'm going to start by creating a new section, obviously. I'm going to just drag it up above the first two-column section that we made earlier. Here it is. Just so that you can see it, I'm going to pop a light grey background on the section, just so it's easier to see against the white background of the other two. And now let's basically recreate the same two-column layout we made earlier. I'm not going to use the automatic layout generator because that uses Flexbox currently. So with the container selected, I'm going to come over to the Elements panel, and I'm going to hit block twice. Block, block. Come over to the structure panel. And that's our two columns here in the structure. Nothing different so far. Now, at this point with Flex, I'd select their parent container to affect the layout of the two columns. And yet, we still do that with CSS Grid. Same rule, select the parent container. Now with the container selected, I'm going to come over to its settings. I'll close the structure panel down just to give us a bit more room. So by default, the container has Flex set on it, Display Flex. And that is just so that we have all of the usual Flexbox controls at our disposal. Instead, I'm going to change this to Display Grid. So now we have Display Grid set on the container, meaning we're now using CSS Grid to lay out our two columns. Nothing's happened. And that is as expected because we've not set anything. Now, you might notice below that we don't have a nice graphical user interface for using CSS Grid like we have for Flex. And that's because with this early version of CSS Grid in Bricks, you actually have to write the code in these text fields. I assume in future updates they're going to introduce an easier page builder style interface, but don't worry, it is actually very easy, especially for the simple column layouts that I'm going to be focusing on here. First job is to set the gap. We'll go 2.5 rem, as always, or 40 pixels. That's added a gap between the two rows, or the two blocks. Note here that there is only one gap control, not separate for columns and rows as we have with Flex. Now to grid template columns. This is where you tell CSS Grid how many columns you want and how you want them to be sized. So let's say we want a two-column 50-50 layout, like we did down here. If I type 50%, look what's happened. That's created one column and it's 50% of the available width. And because we have two blocks in the container, it's just automatically created another row underneath for us for the other column to go. So it's one column because I've typed one width. Now, if I type a space and then 50% again, now I've typed two numbers, two widths. So now we have two columns. Column 1 is taking up 50% of the available width inside the container, column 2, another 50%. And because both of our blocks are both taken care of, there's no need for another row. If I change this setting here to, say, 75% and 25%, now column 1 takes up 75% of the space, column 2 takes up 25%. I'm going to delete both of these a second. Now see that without setting any number of columns here, the blocks just fill 100% of the available width, which is what blocks do. Now the same logic applies to grid template rows below as well, but with rows, the measurements are obviously going to be height instead of width. So let's say if for some reason we wanted one of the rows to take up 25% of the height, and the second row 75% of the height, there you go. Okay, I'm going to delete that now as well, because the majority of the time with CSS Grid, you won't actually have to declare anything about rows at all. In a huge amount of cases, CSS Grid just handles adding rows automatically. Now, there is a much better way of stating the width than percentages, because with percentages, you've got to actually work it out yourself, and it can get complicated when you add in any extra left and right padding and borders and things like that, which is actually one of the issues you can run into with Flexbox. Now, luckily, CSS Grid has its own special unit of measurement that only CSS Grid has, and that is the FR unit, or fractional unit. Let me show you. It's very simple. Here we're setting the number of columns. If I type 1 FR, that means 1 fractional unit, and a space, and then 1 FR again. Again, we have two numbers here, so we have two columns. The first one takes up 1 fractional unit of the space, the other takes up another 1 fractional unit of the space. Or to put it another way, column 1 takes up 1 equal chunk of the available space, column 2 takes up another equal chunk. CSS Grid does all the maths for you. It's like 50%, 50%, but without having to actually give a specific percentage number, which, as I mentioned, can get awkward and unpredictable in some layouts with Flex. Let's take this further. Let's say we wanted the first column to be 2/3 and the second column 1/3. That's really easy. I'm going to set the first column to be 2 FR, and the other one I'm going to leave at 1 FR. So now the first column takes up 2 equal chunks of the available space, and the second column takes up 1 equal chunk. See? This column is taking up 1/3, this column is taking up 2/3, for a total of 3 equal chunks. 2 FR and 1 FR equals 3. Okay, another example. What if we wanted, say, 75% and 25%? Well, that would be 3 FR and 1 FR. Column 1 takes up 3 equal chunks. Column 2 takes up 1 equal chunk. Okay, I'm going to pop this back to 1 FR, 1 FR, taking us back to a 50-50. Now, we're still in the container. I'm going to insert another block. Come up to the Elements panel, hit Block. Okay, what's going on here? Well, now if I come to the Structure panel quickly, now we have 3 blocks, see? But it looks like we actually have 4. Well, looking at this logically, in the grid template columns, we've told CSS Grid we want 2 columns because there are 2 numbers. So it's created 2 columns for us. It's doing as we've told it. Now with the first 3, if I hover over them, you can see they are actual blocks that we can put content into. But the fourth one here isn't. It's just a placeholder, just to show us our grid. Now remember that we have 3 blocks. So if I want a 3-column layout, I actually have to type 3 numbers in the grid template columns field. Yeah, so I'm going to add another 1 FR, 1 equal chunk, 1 equal chunk, 1 equal chunk. And now we have 3 columns. And because I've set the width of each of them to be 1 fractional unit or 1 FR, each one is taking up 1 equal chunk of the available width. What if I wanted, say, the first column to be 50% and then the other 2 take up 25%? Well, if you think that 50% is actually 2 25%, that's going to be 2 equal chunks in the 50% and 1 equal chunk in the other 2 columns. So the first column is using 2 of the equal chunks, and then the other 2 columns are using 1. I'm going to pop the first column back to 1 FR again, just so that they're all equal. Using fractional units, for me, is the biggest advantage of using CSS Grid for column layouts, because it just takes away any need to calculate percentages, which can be unpredictable sometimes. One last thing that is another huge benefit of CSS Grid over Flexbox for column layouts, let's have a look how it wraps our columns onto new rows. Now, if you notice again, our grid template rows field is empty. So we're not actually telling Grid here to create any rows at all. But CSS Grid has actually already created one for us. That's the one with the columns in. Well, by default, CSS Grid will automatically create any number of rows you need, and it'll wrap your columns properly for you at the correct widths, which, as I say, is something Flexbox can't do very well. So we still have our container selected. I'm going to come over to the Elements panel again, and I'm going to hit block 3 times to add 3 more blocks to our container. 1, 2, 3. And let's add another 3 for luck. 1, 2, 3. So now if I come back to the CSS Grid rules that we just set on the container, I've not changed them. See, we told it we wanted 3 columns because we have 3 numbers. Each column 1 fractional unit wide, or 1 equal chunk wide. And that's it. Really easy. And CSS Grid is just automatically creating any additional rows that we need to wrap the rest of our blocks. And so finally, before we wrap up, let's have a look at how we would convert all these layouts to CSS Grid. It's really easy. Well, actually, the first section, the site header, we can leave as it is because Flex was perfect for that one, aligning the content elements left and right with space between inside the container. That's what Flex excels at. So let's have a look at the next section. Remember, that's our 2-column layout, 50-50. So I'll select the parent of the columns, go over to the settings, change display from Flex to Grid, set the gap as 2.5 rem, and our grid template columns 1FR and 1FR. Easy enough. Let's come to Tablet. On Tablet, we want to drop down to 1 column. So in grid template columns, 1FR. That's it. We want 1 column and all the blocks to take up 1 equal chunk of the width. Mobile landscape. Okay, on mobile landscape, I'll just drop the gap down to 2 rem, as we did before. Again, that's both column gap and row gap in one. And then let's check out portrait. And that looks great. So as an exercise, I'm going to let you take care of converting the remaining sections to CSS Grid, if you want to, that is. No pressure. If you prefer to leave them as Flex, then that is absolutely fine. But hopefully you can see here how useful CSS Grid can be, even with our very simple examples here. And although this early bricks implementation of CSS Grid, it's a bit basic with the text fields that you have to actually put the code in, you can see that it is really not that hard. I highly recommend you learn more about CSS Grid though, because it's amazing. Bricks does have a docs page on it, which is great, but you kind of need to know CSS Grid already to really make the most of it. I actually recommend you take a look at a couple of Kevin Powell's videos, particularly this one to start with. Get started with Grid without being overwhelmed, and then move on to learn CSS Grid the easy way. I've dropped links to all of these below the video. Have fun with CSS Grid, and let me know if you have any problems or questions. And that, my friend, wraps up Module 3. So in Module 4, we are going to move on to creating the header and footer for our site. I'll see you there.